Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to our VETchat podcast. Very, very pleased to have Magdoline Awad on the podcast today, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Greencross. We've been doing a whole series of Chief Medical Officer interviews. Thanks to a conversation I had with Brent Mayab, who's the CMO at Royal Canin. And we said, wouldn't it be fun to just find out how these vets had come to these positions? So it's great to see you, Magdoline. Obviously, first time was at London Vet Show, I think just as you were starting at Greencross.
That's right.
And then lovely to see you last month. Have a proper chat with you as well and find out. I think there's a lot of things we share in common that hopefully will come out during the podcast. But I know how busy you are, so thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Thanks, Anthony. And you can call me Mags, by the way.
Okay, thanks, Mags. Mags, just perhaps for audience benefit, tell us a little bit about how you came into becoming a vet and a little bit about your career up to date.
Yeah, so went to uni at Sydney University and graduated in 1994, so over 30 years ago. I actually didn't know what to do when I left school, but I sort of fell into vet. I also wanted to be a lawyer, and I'll come back to that talking about my career so far. But when I graduated, I actually worked in private practice for a year in Sydney in small animal practice. And then I had the opportunity to work at RSPCA New South Wales. And at the time, the RSPCA in Sydney was probably one of the biggest hospitals in Australia in terms of volume of animals coming through. So there was a high workload. There was a lot of vets on every day. You know, we're talking between 7 and 10 veterinarians on a given day. It was quite an interesting environment because we had a fully equipped hospital and we saw privately owned clients and patients, and we saw our, stray animals and surrendered animals that came through the shelter. But we also had a workload that consisted of, animals that had been seized under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So those animals that ended up in court matters. So there was quite a variety of work. And I think that's what made it very challenging, but also quite exciting because at that time, a lot of these animals came in and they needed treatment. And that treatment can consist of anything from vaccinating and desexing and microchipping to fractured legs and all sorts surgeries that we could perform on these animals in order to make them adoptable and in order to make sure that we're preparing them for a life outside of the shelter. So the experience level that we got at the RSPCA was huge. And I think it really cemented a lot of things that I believe are really important. And that's making sure that you're in a really supportive environment with a lot of support from other vets, but also in an environment where you're continuously learning and improving your skill set. And sometimes that involves doing a lot of something. And so when you do a lot of something, it becomes second nature. I liken it to muscle memory. You kind of remember what you're doing because you've done so much of it. And sort of, for me, that confidence grew quite quickly when I got to RSPCA because I was able to do so much and see so many cases. So you got exposed to a lot. In that job, I also, found my way into a management role. Somebody saw in me, I guess, someone who takes on responsibility, so I was slowly given responsibility and it became sort of someone who was what we call a senior vet and then a managing vet in that practice. And I was looking after, I was only maybe 3 or 4 years out and I was looking after vets who were, over 20 years out. So, when I say looking after, I wasn't telling them what to do clinically, but from a, leadership position. And I always say to people, play to your strengths. I always used to get upset about how much responsibility I had growing up. I was the second oldest of 7, but sometimes the things that you grow up and become second nature, like responsibility and having to look after people, becomes something of a strength. And I think that helped me in my roles, in leadership roles as well, because obviously a lot of leadership roles involve people. And then I became the chief vet for RSPCA New South Wales, and I stayed in that role for 7 years. So we looked after, we had 4 hospitals across New South Wales. We had over 100 staff in the hospitals. I think we had really good standards of care. And I think that was one of the really nice things about having the private hospital as well, because we got to see clients coming in and we were able to actually make money in a way to offset some of the costs of looking after shelter animals as well. So it was kind of a nice way that people came to us because we had a good level of care, but also because they wanted to give back to the community, and so that was kind of a nice sort of sustainable way to keep the hospital going.
Do you think, Mags, collaborative leadership, is that more, and I can get probably told off for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Is it more of a maternal thing? Are women more collaborative, and so therefore, and also your whole sort of history of obviously looking after younger siblings. Did that make you just a more empathetic individual, do you think?
Look, I think female leaders, I do think they think differently as well.
Yeah.
I think we naturally don't have as much confidence in our abilities as
Hmm.
I guess some of the male counterparts. And I'm not, it's
Yeah.
not to discredit. It's just I think that's what I've learnt.
Yeah.
And I
I would
always say,
agree with that.
yeah, and it was interesting when I had. I'll talk about my next job soon, but one of my jobs, I had someone who was assigned to me as a coach, and she said to me, "When you go into those executive meetings, I want you to remember this. I don't want you to say I think." She said, "I want you to not say this is what I know," and you
Yeah.
have to be that kind of person because you know we take it for granted that as women, I guess, that we just do things and it gets done, but I think we don't have that assertiveness that others have. And I think well, I know
Hmm.
that sometimes
Yeah.
we just, it's like anything, you have to practice it and you have to believe it and you have to think it.
My wife is a leader. She just moved schools. She's a deputy head in a school, and if we often say if she had my confidence and I had her ability, we'd make a really super team, or a super leader. Because it's exactly right. She is so good at what she does, and yet she doubts. So she's moved to a new school and said, "Can I add value in here? Because it looks as if it's so good." But once she gets in and goes, "Oh, actually, no, I can add value there. Oh, this is something I can do." But I think often again, men will go, I can do 5 things of the 10 things needed for this job. I'll fake it till I make it on the other 5. Whereas women have to be able to do 11 of them before they'll actually take the job on. Maybe women are more perfectionists. I know you love perfectionism, don't you, Mags? Or not, as the case may be.
I think we all have a bit of that in us because we all want to
Yeah,
do the best that we can do.
yeah,
But I think when it becomes something that isn't manageable, it's because our expectations of ourselves are really high, and we're not living or working in a perfect world or a perfect
yeah.
environment all the time. And when things go well, they go well, and you can pat yourself on the shoulder and say
Mm,
everything's gone well. But I think, especially in our profession, we have so many things that affect how we do our job. The resources of the client, whether they
yeah.
can pay for the services, the animal that walks in the door, whether it's able to be, looked after, and we can do something for it. And the other thing is, do we have the resources in our clinics? Not every clinic
Mm,
is equipped, with an MR and a CT,
mm,
and a specialist surgeon. So sometimes we just have to do the best with what we've got and what the client can, manage. And I think that concept of conceptualized care, making sure that we're, doing what we need to do for that particular animal and that particular client in that situation. That's become sort of trendy now, but it was actually what we used to do many, many
yeah,
years ago anyway,
exactly.
because we didn't have all the resources that we have now, like referral and specialty and,
Yeah.
all those nice to have. So those sorts of things of, from a perfectionist perspective, I think the way that I think perfectionism can work is if we understand that it's not a perfect world and we need to be able to maneuver ourselves around that and just work with what we've got and do the best we can.
No, that's brilliant, Mags. Just maybe before we just move on to Greencross, I just listened to you. That job at the RSPCA, so powerful because it's that volume of work, and sometimes I feel those first 2-3 years in practice, if you're doing that volume, you're doing 5 bitch bays a week, it becomes more routine. It is one of those areas that I know a lot of vets struggle to get the confidence with bitch bays and things. So it is almost, maybe at the start we have to say this is going to be hard work for the first 2 years, but actually once you get to a certain stage, 80% of what we do is actually pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Anthony, because I think, sometimes for young graduates, and I've hired a lot of graduates over the years, we were a job that a lot of people wanted to come into because of,
Yeah,
the ability to gain that experience in a supportive environment. So I think for me, one of the biggest learnings is, you have to go through some adversity, and you have to go through some, hard times. Now, what I mean by that is you have to be prepared to do things that are outside your comfort zone. But I always say that with respect, because I think, you do the things outside your comfort zone knowing that there is support there for you.
yeah,
So we're not asking people to go and do their first GDV on their own without any support. What we're saying is you can be in a supportive environment but outside your comfort zone. And that's
yeah,
really the way that you stretch yourself and you grow. And so sometimes it's going to be hard in those first few years, but that's part of any job. That's part of life. It's hard in the first few years when you have kids.
yeah,
And you just, it just happens that you have to get through it. And sometimes I think that if we make it too easy to not go out of your comfort zone, I think that's where your confidence doesn't grow.
yeah.
Maybe even the boredom. Maybe you
Well,
start
I was going to
doubting
say the
yourself.
job becomes boring, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you start doubting yourself because,
Mm,
like anything, once you've not done something for a long time, or once you convince yourself that you can't do it, it becomes really hard to pick it up again. So, I really do believe that you need to stretch yourself in those first few years, but I also think the environment needs to support that. So, we're not talking about doing 15-hour days or being on call after working all day or working every weekend.
mm,
That's got to go. And I think, hopefully that has been bred out
yeah,
of our profession. But what I'm saying is, I think there needs to be some ownership of the growth that you want to have and that learning experience with the support of people like ourselves who've had that growth and experience
yeah,
and the wisdom to know what's worth worrying about, because as
yeah,
you know, when you're a grad, you worry about everything. You go home and you look things up and you worry about your cases and you don't sleep at night. But as you get older and you've had more experience, you can learn to sleep a lot more. And I think that's where the older vets like ourselves potentially have had that experience and wisdom. And that's, I think, what we give back to the
yeah,
younger graduates. We need to give back the calmness and the, don't worry about that. That'll be fine. You can sleep tonight.
yeah.
Those sorts of
And
things.
actually, most of what we worry about never happens. So it's corrosive and
Yes.
unnecessary, isn't it?
Yeah, and we do catastrophize
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a lot
yeah,
in our
yeah.
profession. And yeah, I remember going home and not sleeping at night and coming back the next day early just to make sure that animal is still there and still
Animals
alive.
still alive. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've all done that once or twice in our career. Tell me a little bit about Green Cross. Obviously, not everybody will know, who the organisation is, but also what your role entails. And I get the feeling just from that first few minutes that, as chief medical officer, mentorship is something that you take really seriously.
Yeah, so just to say, between the Greencross job and my
Yeah,
job and the RSPCA job, I worked for 4.5 years as a chief veterinary officer for PetSure, which is Australia's largest pet insurance company. So for me to
right.
go from a not-for-profit to a financial services was a big change. But I
Yeah,
learned a lot about veterinary economics and the veterinary landscape, not just in Australia, but around the world, and what pet insurance can do for our profession. So that was a really good learning curve. And then going from PetSure to Greencross, I guess, was also a big change because I'd never worked for a corporate. But it's interesting because the idea of a corporate outside of our business is not the reality. And while we run a lot of practices, we've got about 150 general practices at Greencross and about 23 emergency and referral hospitals nationally. It doesn't feel like I'm working for a corporate because you still have that veterinary kind of leadership role, and your role is to, or my role is to make sure the people on the ground can do their jobs and do them well and remove some of the friction points. Really, my job is to make their job easier. When I talk about Greencross, I've been there for 5.5 years now, and I've seen a lot of changes to the profession that time. I started just before COVID, and you and I both know what happened during COVID.
yeah, yeah,
The great thing about Australia, and I don't know if you know this, Anthony, but in Australia, vets were deemed an essential service very early on. So it became something that we ended up being busier than we ever were, not just for Greencross, but every single vet in Australia. And I think, that was a really good time for vet, but it also changed how we recruit. It changed veterinary salaries
Yeah.
across Australia and across the world because there became a shortage because the demand was so high. We saw a massive increase in Australia in the number of pets
Same as
entering.
in UK.
I think it was the first time ever that the RSPCA shelter was empty.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And they
Mm,
didn't have any animals to rehome. And
mm.
if you look at today, with the economic crisis, that's a complete opposite scenario.
Very good, yeah.
So things can change very quickly in our profession, as you know, with
Yeah.
COVID. But I also think what happened, and it was really interesting because when I started, I think that's when I met you in London.
Yeah, I think it was just before COVID. It was obviously 2019 November, wasn't it, at London Vet
Yeah.
Show?
Yeah. And I think I started in December, and by February, everyone was talking about COVID. And by March, I was sitting at home, trying to work out how we were going to manage these clinics and
Yeah,
how we were going to work in a COVID environment. So
yeah.
it was very stressful. But what I learned was when you have to change and when you have to do something, you just do it.
Mm,
And it's funny because everyone used to say, oh, vets are hesitant to change and they're reluctant to change. They don't like change. But at the end of the day, when it's forced on you, I think
well,
people just do what they need to do. And I think it worked out really well because, we made allowances for the fact that we couldn't see people, but we could see the animals.
mm,
And I think most people were generally happy with veterinary services because they couldn't do a lot of other things. So going to the vet became something that was quite a treat for them.
yeah,
But very quickly, I think the economic crisis hit, everywhere, and the cost of
yeah.
living went up due to COVID, but also due to a lot of other factors. But we found ourselves in a different environment, and like I said, whereas before, I think it was. The shortage of vets was very obvious. We still have a relative shortage of vets in Australia, but certainly not at the levels that we had during COVID because obviously our borders were closed and we in Australia we always have influx of overseas vets coming in and working, especially from the UK, coming in to do their 2 years of traveling around Australia and
Yes.
working in
Yeah,
practice. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Obviously, we've talked about your career, but actually, it's your backstory as well that I found really fascinating. As we chatted in Melbourne, I obviously didn't really realize some of these things. Obviously, Lebanese Catholic, brought up, as the Civil War was looming, coming over to Australia, having family over there who went through, horrendous things. There's obviously echoes of that in everything that's happening in Palestine and the Holy Land at the moment. And I remember you talking about your cousin who you were in America with, and she was, petrified you weren't coming back from your run and things. So, obviously, talk a little bit about that, but also, as a young child, you actually suffered really serious burns, didn't you?
So I was actually born in Lebanon. My dad was actually in Australia when I was born. He'd come out here, and he made a couple of trips back. Obviously missed the family. We had mum had 3 kids before we came to Australia, but when I was 3, I was burnt to 30% of my body, mostly my scalp and my left arm. And I was in hospital for about 6 months. And my dad was in Australia at the time. My mum, who I don't know how she did it with 2 other young kids, but we had back in, I don't know if you know much about Beirut, but back in the early 70s, Beirut was what we consider the Paris of the
Yeah,
Middle East. And
yeah,
there were a lot of amazing doctors and hospitals in Beirut. And I was kind of lucky to be alive because 30% of your body is quite a lot when you're a young child.
yeah.
So I spent about 6 months in hospital, and I don't remember any of it actually at all.
Thank God.
Yeah, which is probably a good thing. But hearing stories from my mum later in my life about how she would leave the hospital and think, "Am I going to be alive
Yeah,
when she comes back?" And the pain of taking bandages off and things. I can't imagine actually how she did it, but I'm very grateful
mm,
that I was able to get through that. And not long after that, the civil war was about to break out in Lebanon in 1975, and my dad was in Australia, and he lobbied the government to fly my mum and my other 2 sisters out to Australia, so kind of like refugees, but actually came out on a plane.
Yeah.
And that was probably, for me, when I look back at my life, I think, thank God that we were able to come out here because, as I was talking to you a few weeks ago, I had a lot of cousins that stayed in Lebanon who lived in the height of the civil war in the 80s. And, in the middle of Beirut, where, obviously there was a lot of, the war was horrendous. And I didn't really sort of, it's not like now where you've got 24/7 social media and TV and everybody commenting on wars and what's happening overseas. But back then, there wasn't a lot of knowledge about how brutal it was. And I think the only thing for me was, that I worried a lot about my parents because and how we grew up was very different to a lot of my friends in Australia because we kind of grew up having two cultures. You're in Australia, you're Australian, but your parents, they're getting phone calls all the time about people dying. And every phone
Mm.
call, I remember telling people every phone call that came out after 10 o'clock at night, I would shiver in my bed saying, I hope it wasn't someone my parents knew really well or a family
Yeah.
member that died. Because, while I didn't live in the war, I kind of, the anxiety around it, it
You
was, it,
vicariously lived through it.
and you live it through your parents as well, because we worried about them a lot. And so I'm one of seven children. So I'm the second oldest of seven, as I mentioned before, a typical Lebanese Catholic family, lots of kids. So we grew up, that's how I grew up. So when you talk about empathy and when you talk about how your childhood affects how you are now, I think I look back
Mm.
at what happened to me and I think the empathy develops because you've lived through it and you can see the things that others can't see or feel. And so I do believe that who I am today has been shaped by, what happened to me and what happened to my family. And I do believe that, all the things that you look at that you think, oh, they were adversities, right? But I look back now and I think, well, they were, but I wouldn't be who I am today if they didn't happen to me.
Mm.
So, it's a really important lesson because my whole life I always felt that I suffered, and I did suffer a lot because of my burns in terms of, how I felt about myself. There's a lot of things that go with burns. They're not just exterior. They're not something that people can see. They're also internal. But what it did was it made me who I am, and it also gave me experiences that I would never have. And people always talk about the journey. I went through a lot of surgeries in my late 20s, early 30s, and the people that I met, I can honestly say I remember that more than any of the pain that I went through having those procedures. So I had a lot of surgery to remove my scars on my arm, and I had a couple of hair transplants. But what I will remember the most was the kindness of that the doctors, the nurses, the psychologists at the hospital. I look at that and I just think that's what I remember. I actually don't
Mm.
remember all the anesthetics and the recovery, and I think that's probably the most important thing about life. You can do a lot of things, you can go through a lot of experiences, but actually it's the people that you meet and the impact that they have on you. And I'd like to think that I'd had some impact on other people. I always tell the story about my hair transplant doctor who, worked in Double Bay, which is like the equivalent of Mayfair or Marylebone in London. And he said to me, it was tens of thousands of dollars of surgery. But he actually did it at such a discounted price, knowing that I was a young vet, but also knowing that I wasn't his normal patient. But
Yeah.
what I took away from that, I brought back to the local hospital where my burns doctor hadn't actually considered a hair transplant doctor for some of his patients. And so
Mm.
I got them to meet and to sort of have that relationship. So
Yeah.
sometimes I think that happens for a reason. And,
Being a connector.
being connected, but also knowing that if I can benefit from something, that potentially someone else in my situation can also benefit as well. So it was actually quite interesting times back then, I would say.
Do you think suffering in some ways helps? What you said, of course, it does helps with growth, but does it make you more compassionate, maybe even more grateful? At a much lower level, I have glaucoma, and I was diagnosed when I went to Australia last time. And I went to see my aunt who was dying, And she said, your eyes look a mess. So I went back, when I went back to Liverpool, I had them checked. My mum had glaucoma, my dad had glaucoma, my granddad had glaucoma. I was 46. I'd not had it checked, as I probably should have done. And the silver lining was it was called young person's glaucoma, which when you're 46, you're actually quite pleased to still be classed as a young
Really.
person. And sometimes, perfect health, perfect sight, you take it for granted. Whereas suddenly, my sight is not as good as it was, but thank God it's very good. It's good. I'm looking at the birds. I can't quite see them as clearly as I used to, but I just think I can see the birds. I can see the trees. The other day I was walking in town and there was a gentleman with a stick, a young man, younger than me, and he was about to walk into a iron post, because he just couldn't see it or that his stick hadn't hit it. And I kind of pushed him with the chest, so with it on his chest, so he missed it. And I just thought, that could be me. There's always somebody worse off than yourself. Gratitude makes your position in life, however poor it is, it makes it easier to deal with it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's a good lesson in life, because I think a lot of my life was spent saying, "Why me? Why did
Mm,
this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this?" And
yeah.
I think we can go through life, and that could be our the way that we look at things. Like, bad things happen to people, and one of the things that we should probably look at is how we can flip that and say, well, why not me?
Mm,
You know, if it wasn't going to happen to me, it's going to happen to someone else, and I'd prefer that it happened to me than someone else in my family. And
yeah.
maybe it happened to me because I could cope with it, or that I could see a way through it. But there are lots of things worse in life, like you said, and sometimes you got to take the positives. And like I said, I don't think I would be the person today that I am if I hadn't have gone through what I went
Mm,
through. And I look at I actually, one of the things I always say to people is always be kind, because you actually don't know someone's backstory. You don't know
yeah.
what happened to them that day or last week, or you know, the last 10 minutes before you met them. And so always come from a good place. I always think that maybe that's a bad thing, to always trust people or think best of people before, before you think otherwise. But I've always come from that space.
I think it's a good characteristic, and it comes very much, I think, from your Catholicity, which is do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, and work from a trust level. I mean, actually, if we don't trust, it's quite a miserable, dangerous place, because you're always looking around corners for somebody to mug you, aren't you, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think when you work in environments where there's a lot of trust,
Yeah,
it's just and a lot of kindness and a lot of care and compassion for each other. I think that's not in every vet practice, unfortunately, and I still believe that the environment in a vet practice is far more important than one bad client, in
yeah.
terms of mental health and people staying in the profession.
Well, it's sustainability, as we've talked about, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I can tell you now, there are always going to be clients that complain or have
Mm,
an experience where it's not great, and or they want to tell you that you haven't done a great job. But we're not the only profession that deals with clients that have that complain. And I would say that, most of our clients are good people. They come in and sometimes they're really anxious and worried about their pets, but worried that they can't pay. And there's a bit of guilt there as well.
mm,
So we always have to come from a good place and try and understand, is there stress levels and the way that they're acting and the way that they're talking to us, is that because of the fact that they've just come home, found their dog collapsed, and aren't financially able to pay
yeah,
and know that. And so always think about those things, because I don't think people act badly, or most people act badly because they are bad people. I think they just find themselves in a bad situation. And we unfortunately see people every day, probably
in
on the
stress.
worst day of their life. Yeah. And so I think that we have to think a bit differently about our clients, and they are people just like us, and we are clients of other professionals as
Mm,
well. And I'm sure that there are days when we, not all of us act professionally sometimes towards others. And I have to say, Bronwyn from Royal Canin. So
yeah.
we found ourselves in Paris at a conference, and on the way back, we were at the airport, and there was a flight cancellation, and so we were on a flight to Dubai, and we had a connecting flight to Australia, and so all the people with connecting flights were able to get on that flight, but all the people that were just going to Dubai had to wait a few more hours for the next flight. And there was this lady working at the counter, and she had about maybe 30 or 40 people in front of her, all screaming and shouting and waving their arms, upset, obviously. They were all business class and first class passengers, upset that their flight had been delayed. And, speaking in four different languages. There was
Yeah.
Arabic, English, French, and I think German, whatever it was. But bottom line is, she was so calm, she was so cool, she treated everyone respectfully and just got on with her job. That, to me, if we would never have 40 screaming clients at us in
Mm.
one day. But the
Yeah.
way she handled it was so professional. And I remember speaking to someone about this, and she said to me, "You know why they acted that way? It's because they've been trained. They've been trained really well to deal with clients that are upset and angry.
Mm.
And so, therefore, they are able to manage that." And I don't think as a profession we get a lot of training in handling clients and handling people who are in conflict with us. And I think it's really important that we do a lot more in that space for our teams, and we do that in Greencross. But I think we should do it across the profession, because I
Yeah.
think if you can develop that skill set and learn that it's not personal, it's just what it is, and to treat it just like any part of your job, this is how you manage it. I think it'd be much easier for us to accept, poor behavior from some clients. Not all clients, but most
Yeah.
clients.
I think that also goes down to culture and values, because if one of your values, whether you are religious or not, is treat others as you would be treated, then actually, if you treat people really nicely, it's really, really tough for them to continue to throw abuse at you, because actually, it usually will calm the situation. Not always, but nine
Yeah.
times out of 10, it will calm the situation down, won't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the lessons I took home from that, because there was about four or five vets. We were sitting there watching this. Is
Watching it, yeah.
we all turned to each other and we thought, oh, we would never ever have that situation, where there's 40
Yes.
clients that were angry at us at one time, and so it made us realize, or made me realize anyway, that we don't actually have a monopoly on bad clients or bad behaviour.
Yeah.
I think one badly behaved client can ruin a day where you've had 40 amazing clients. And so I think we need to think differently about our clients, and maybe flip it and say, look, that person's just having a bad day. Sometimes I have a bad day. That person's really stressed and anxious about their pet, and they're finding it difficult to come up with the finances. Let's listen to them. Let's treat them with respect. And most people just want to be heard and want you to acknowledge that you've listened to them as well. So I think it's a really good lesson in what type of information and training that we need our teams to have to be able to deal with the things that stress us out, including clients that are behaving badly.
And I think for us to be able to do that well, obviously things like being able to go to the toilet during work hours is important, having a lunch break. But then when you get home, having something that helps to de-stress you, whether it be, I like to play the guitar. I'm at the Oxford Bar on Thursday night. It's quite a distance for you to come, Mag, so I'm not inviting you, but I like to play the guitar there. I am now a bit more of a staggerer or a jogger than a runner, but I know you're also a runner. Is that a
Yeah.
stress buster for you, like it is for me?
Yeah, I can honestly say that I tell people all the time, running is like a drug. And I think if I wasn't running, I'd be doing something else that had, it's almost an obsession for me. I
Yeah.
can't function without having run every morning, and I've been doing that for probably 35 years now.
Mm.
The only time I didn't run was when I was pregnant, but I walked and swam a lot. So one of the things I've learned in life is that you do what you love to do, and
Mm.
if you love to do something, you will always make time for it. When you hear people say, I don't have time to do something, if you really wanted to do something, you will make the
Mm.
time. I've been known to get up at 3:30 in the morning to go for a run before an early flight, because I can't miss my run.
Yeah, yeah.
But I won't do that to, go to the pub. I don't drink actually, Anthony, so it's no
Yeah.
use inviting me, but you can invite my husband. Um,
Well, you can have a lemonade.
I have a Diet Coke, that's another, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you actually love something, you will make the time, and I truly believe that because you prioritize what you value.
Exactly.
And I think that is something that there's no point in running if you don't like it. Go find something
Mm.
else that you like to do, because all you'll do is resent the time that you spent trying to do it and hating it. I don't do spreadsheets.
Yeah.
I tell people, please don't send me a spreadsheet because it does my head in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just send me some dot points or pick up the phone and call me and tell me what you found. But I, and because I don't like it, and I don't need it, I can put my effort into something that I'm good at, and that I
Yeah.
can be someone who is useful for something else. And I think that's an important thing. I think a lesson that we learn in life as well. I think as vets, being a general practice vet, and I know we talked about this before, a lot of vets think I'm just a general practice vet, I'm just a GP, but the breadth and depth of knowledge that you need to have to work in general practice is enormous. And I think we don't value it enough. And I think if
Mm.
we did, like, in general practice for doctors now, there is a specialty in general practice, because it's acknowledged that,
Yeah.
it
It's a
is something that.
specialty.
Exactly. So I think we need to stop. We need to stop thinking that we're just general practice vets. And I think there's some really good, evidence that if you can be happy in general practice, and I know a lot of my colleagues who are still in practice and enjoying it, it's because you're comfortable in what you're doing. You're still stretching yourself. You're
Mm.
still learning. A lot of vets do a lot of CE. In our Greencross, we have an amazing CE. We include vet webinar, but like we allow our teams to have as much CE as they possibly want or can do. Doesn't mean you have to do, CE every day, but what it means is it's available and you don't have to worry that you have to pay for it. It's just included. So by
Mm.
making it available, people can choose what they want to do. Some people learn better at workshops. Some people learn better listening to webinars or podcasts. Some people prefer to have one-on-one. So I
Mm.
think the important thing is that there is choice, and I have always believed that when you have choice and opportunity, it's a really good place to be. And I feel like in my career, I was lucky that I had the opportunities and the choice to do things. But I also believe I worked hard as well. And sometimes those opportunities come when you least expect it. And certainly, things like I'm the president of the Veterinary Board for New South Wales. And, it wasn't something that I graduated and thought, oh, I'm going to be the president of the board. It's just something that came up and I took that opportunity. It's a lot of work, but I really enjoy it and I want to give back to the profession as well. So those sorts of things give me joy, and I think you should always do things that allow you to grow, but also allow you to give back. And I know that we talked about volunteering.
Yeah.
It's such a great thing to do. And I think a lot of veterinarians, they volunteer for Vets Beyond Borders or other overseas or other charities in Australia like Pets in the Park or AMREC. So I think a lot of vets love giving back, and I think giving back means that you're actually benefiting as well. So there
Yeah.
is
You
merit.
always get more than you give, don't you?
Yeah, yeah. And I think those sorts of things. And look, it doesn't have to be vet related. A lot of vets give back in other ways. A lot of vets that work for charities that
Mm.
are outside of veterinary, and it could be charities that have nothing to do with vet. I know that I actually had a brain tumor in 2017, started 2017, so about 9 years ago now. I had no idea that I had a ticking time bomb in my head. In fact, I found out because I had a major seizure in bed one morning, and a few hours later, I found myself looking at a CT scan of a 6.5 centimeter brain tumor sitting in my head. And I think, while it was a bit of a shock, I think the one thing I took out of seeing that tumor was, as you know, when you have a seizure, there's a lot of things you can't do after that. But the great thing was they found something. And I remember saying to the doctor, "Oh, great, you found something. When can we remove it?" And my husband, who was white as a ghost
Yeah.
and in shock, looked at me like, "What are you talking about? There's a brain tumor." I'm like, "Yeah, but there's something, which means that
Something
if
we
they
can
remove it,
cause.
I'll be okay."
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was a really interesting time. My kids were 5 and 7 at the time. But I think the one thing I remember is my attitude towards what I saw and what happened to me. I remember thinking to myself, yes, this has happened and I can't do anything to change that. But what I can do is change how I react to what's happened to me. And so I took that as great. I've got a week before the surgery. I went and did my will. I never had a will. And I tried to reassure my family. My parents were obviously devastated. My family was devastated, but I tried to be as normal as possible and try to just be clinical. Like, we're doctors, we're
Mm.
vets. It's a meningioma. I'm 100% sure because the doctor said he's pretty sure about that. It was in a good
Yeah.
spot, and it was about a 6.5 hour surgery, or 5.5 hour surgery, I think. And he was able to completely remove it. And it was a grade 1 meningioma, so I didn't need any further radiation therapy or chemotherapy. And one of the things that I think I was very grateful for was that it actually allowed me to stop. I was
Yes.
I was someone who never stopped. In fact, I had literally handed in a paper for a conference that week. So on the Tuesday, and I had the seizure on the Thursday night. And I don't know how I wrote that paper, but I did it. And you just don't know what you're capable of, and you don't know
Yeah.
what's around the corner. So I think it just made me live my life a little bit differently.
Well, I think it's living life in the present moment, and it's also being kind to yourself that, with that perfectionism, you don't have to be able to do
Yeah,
everything perfectly, do you?
yeah. And one of the other things was I always had my parents to look after my kids when I was working, and they wanted to do more for me, and I was like, no, you don't need to do more for me. I'm capable. But then I realized that actually they got joy out of doing more.
Yeah.
And so I let them. And for the first time in my life, I thought, there's a lot of things that I do to give, and it's nice to be able to have other people,
Yeah.
do the same.
Yeah.
I was back running, by the way, 6 weeks later.
Well, I was going to say, the running thing is obviously important, but on the Saturday at the Vet Symposium in Melbourne, I was running around Lake Albert as the park run, because we have the park run in Liverpool as well. And of course, you had some sort of excuse of some sort of sporting event between two siblings. But I think you were just running scared from me, you see.
No, look, I'm what they call a netball mum, and a
Yes.
football mum. So my kids play a lot of sport. So that day I had a preliminary final, and both my daughters were on separate teams playing each other. So I had to go home to that. But I would have loved to have run
Yeah.
around Lake Albert with you. Would have done next time for sure.
In the end, we were all chatting about what would be the best result, and I think the elder beat the younger, which was probably the best way, wasn't it? In the end.
Yeah, it kept the peace in our family. I can tell you
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The result that I needed happened. So yeah.
Mags, it's been so good chatting to you. You can see that adversity could crush people, but actually it's helped you to grow and become more empathetic. And it's been a privilege for me to listen to it and be able to share that story with you. So thank you for being so kind and open during the podcast. I've really enjoyed chatting.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I always think that storytelling is so powerful. And, if you can help someone with your story and, help them to understand that, you can achieve things despite or in spite of what's happened to you.
Yeah,
And a lot of the good things that have happened professionally to me have happened, after I had kids, after I had my brain tumor as well. So, even in the worst of your moments, good things do happen. So I think that's being grateful is something that I take with me all the time. Very much grateful that I had opportunities, but also that I was able to have good outcomes, especially around my brain tumor and things like that.
yeah. Thank God. But, grateful for your time. I know how busy you are. I know it's getting a bit later in Australia. So enjoy the rest of the evening. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.